Hi, this week to start off week 4, I want to talk to you about the major goal of this week, which is to write a draft of your genre analysis project. To do that today, I'm going to review a few key points from the genre analysis project description and then talk you through the student sample that I have posted in the week 4 folder. When you prepare to work on a new project, even if you've already read the project description, it's a good idea to take a few minutes to go back through with a pen or a highlighter and hit some of the major points that you want to keep in mind as you're working on the project. I probably haven't highlighted everything that you would want to highlight in this text, but I'll give you a few things that I would pay a special attention to as I'm getting ready to write the genre analysis. You've already done a little bit of work in preparation for this by simply selecting one of the writing studies articles that I assigned you and one article from the discourse community that you're studying. Ideally, this article has something to do with one of the research questions that you're thinking about asking so that you can start to dig into that topic a little bit more. But the key thing is that it is a peer-reviewed article from the discourse community that you're studying. So you'll want to make sure that that is set and ready to go. And I'll be reading blogs as soon as possible this week to give you feedback on that. So that's our project, practicing reading, analyzing, and even using or getting ready to use these genres. The major goal here is to compare the article from your discourse community or from a journal in that discourse community to one in writing studies so that we can learn a little bit about what we can find from comparing features and thinking about how those features are used. You're going to write this project using 3 major sections: an identification section, an analysis section, and then a reflection in which you start to tie together the things that you're learning through doing the analysis. So in the assignment description, we have listed several brainstorming questions that can help you think through what you might be looking at in this project. It's careful to notice that, like we say in here, you might ask other questions in addition to these. You won't be able to answer all of these questions. Some of these questions might not even be useful for your project or might not apply depending on the articles that you're looking at. I'll give you an example of that when I talk through the sample paper in a few minutes. But use these questions to help you start brainstorming. Another thing that I want you to check out in our week 4 activities is this set of generative questions for working through the genre analysis. Questions about audience and purpose, rhetorical issues, structure and style and language that might help you develop more ideas that would feed into your identification and analysis sections. So use this as well to help you work through brainstorming. Ultimately, then you're going to compose a 4 to 5 page essay in which you're identifying, analyzing, and reflecting on these journal articles. Select MLA or APA style as appropriate to your discourse community. When you look in the week 4 folder, you'll see a student sample, and I'm going to upload 2 more documents. One is this same sample with annotations that I'll go through in a moment, and then I'll upload a second student sample. And I would encourage you, as part of your preparation process this week, to open up the second sample and ask the same kind of question that I ask as I go through the first example. The question that you should ask as you're reviewing a draft, or that would be useful the first time you're working through, is something like this: what rhetorical moves can we track as we look through this draft? So what kinds of writing moves does the student make in the paper itself? That's going to help me start to think about, okay, maybe I've never written a genre analysis before, but to look at an example and think about what kinds of things the student writer is doing and the degree to which they seem to be successful is a way I can start to think about a draft. So I'll work through that here with a sample 1, and then I would encourage you to do that on your own time with sample 2. So I'm going to just talk through some of the features of this. And again, you'll see the annotations here on the side. One of the first moves that the student makes in this draft is to identify and define the discourse community that's being examined, and then to mention some of the values of that end up being important in this genre analysis. That's information that is likely developed or has been substantiated in Project 1, and now the student can use that information here to introduce the genre analysis and reiterate key parts of the discourse community to their reader in the genre analysis. Another thing that happens in a short introduction paragraph is that the writer describes why considering genre is useful. So thinking about what is to be gained from looking at and understanding genre in a discourse community. So some of that is information and concepts that you might get from looking at the discourse community articles that I'm having you read from writing studies. Some of it might be information or ideas that you understand from looking at the Wadsworth Guide. Some of it might be other information that you gleaned while working on Project 1. This writer uses headings to separate the identification, analysis, and reflection sections. That's probably a pretty good general move for you to make. Early in the identification section, the student describes what can be gained by looking at the differences and similarities between genre conventions in two discourse communities. So that's reiterating the purpose of the genre analysis assignment. When I read that, I think that would be really helpful to include as a guiding thesis in the introduction. So this whole sentence right here, or this whole paragraph, might be better placed in the section before it. And that is a sentence that will help us figure out as readers what is going to happen as I read through this text. And then a more developed analysis of that, potentially even an analytical argument, will emerge through the analysis and reflection sections. A good move to make here, the student identifies the article being examined. This would be even stronger if the student included the title of the journal that the article is from. This student references other things about the way the journal is structured, but never actually tells us which one it's from. And that could tell us a lot about how it's organized. If I think about the differences in journals in composition studies, the audiences, even though they all appeal to the broader discourse community of composition studies, are sometimes slightly different, and some of the expectations of those journals are a little bit different. And so maybe starting to think about how the specific journals articles are set up could be a good move in Project 2. When the student introduces the article, they give us a quick one-sentence summary of content and purpose. You should be prepared to do that because you will have written summaries in your blog 2 posts, so you can streamline those from short abstracts of the texts down to a sentence or two, as well as introduce some of the other elements of the rhetorical situation that you can identify, things like who the audience is, what the context is. If possible, you could consider looking at the rest of that issue of the journal to see if that gives you any information that helps you think about context as well. Make sure that as you're writing your text, you use citation properly throughout the document so that your readers can identify key locations in the text being analyzed. And not just so that readers can do it, but so that if you want to look at something, you remember which page it was on. This author has selected APA format. I know that because when I go and look at the bibliography at the end, the citations are in APA format. So based on that, this citation should actually include the author's last names and the page number. And I have a citation right here. So make sure not just that you're using citation, but that you're doing that correctly. There are a lot of things that you'll have to think about whether or not it's useful for me to identify this in the identification section. So you're going to have to think, I can't cover every single thing that's happening, but what seems most important? Many peer-reviewed journal articles will have headings in them to separate key sections. So one good thing that this student does is not just identifying what the headings are, like background and model development and discussion, etc., but also thinks about why they're organized the way that they are. So we have a sense of the logical structure of the article through this introduction sentence here. As you draft your genre analysis, I want you to make sure that you think carefully about paragraph organization. Again, because there are so many things that you might be identifying, you need to think about composing paragraphs that are focused on main ideas. This particular paragraph is covering a lot of ground. The student is writing about a particular long section and what's happening in there, talking about citation, talking about visual styles and visual aids that are in the text, talking about active voice, and it's a way too much happening in that paragraph. Each of those ideas might be important, but you'll want to think about developing a paragraph for each key idea in your identification that not only includes what the general concept or a thing is that you're identifying, but also where we can see that happening in the text. Also think about balance in your analysis throughout the project. In just this first section, the student writer spends 2.5 pages identifying key features of the first article, but only gives 1 paragraph to the second article, the writing studies article. You should give both articles that you've chosen their due in this project, trying to balance out those key identifications, giving each one the same amount of space, and reading them in similar depth. As you move into the analysis, you're really going to be answering the question, so what? So you've identified all of these features that you see, these genre conventions that stand out to you in the articles. Now you have to think about what those features say about the discourse communities using the genres, why those features are important. So partially you might draw from the knowledge you developed during Project 1 and extend that knowledge through careful examination of these texts. A bonus is that conducting this analysis might also help you develop or refine your potential research questions. So as you're working through analysis, if you're thinking of things, if ideas pop in your mind, jot those down while they come to you. A couple last points that I'll make. This particular sample has the student writing a lot about active and passive voice. Like the assignment prompt says, you won't be able to write about everything, so you're going to have to think about which points merit discussion in your project. I know I keep repeating this, but I really want you to think about it. It might be that you see items like active or passive voice as important, and it may be that they're not important. So think carefully about that. You don't have to identify everything there is to identify just for the sake of including it. The last thing I'll say is that when I get to reading the reflection section of this paper, it feels like a rather limited and general reflection, kind of like a reflection that any one of us could come to from comparing a couple of articles. So make sure in your reflection that you tie the conclusions you come to specific examples from those texts you're analyzing as evidence that supports those conclusions. Imagine if all somebody read was just the reflection, this concluding section. How would they know that you've actually done these things? Bring some specific examples, even the examples that you've cited earlier in the text, to these reflections to help you come to these conclusions.